This week we're going to look at environmental archaeology, which is related to climate science and geology and several other fields. So there's a lot of overlap between reconstructing ancient environments and its use in archaeology and also other disciplines. And environmental archaeology is obviously a fairly important topic because the environment gives us some background to understand how human beings are living in a certain area at a certain time. That is, I like to think of the environment as setting up constraints and opportunities for ancient people. So there were certain things that they could do, there were certain things that they couldn't do. The environment could yield lots of food, it could put strain on people, depending on the weather patterns and depending on the climate change. So it's important to know about the ancient climate and the ancient environment, what food was available, where water was, what was the temperature like, to really understand what was going on at that time. Without that important piece of the puzzle, we just won't understand the full picture. And you can see here this book, kind of a popular history of the Little Ice Age, which took place between 1300 and 1850. This was not really an ice age, but it was just a cold period that around different times within this larger period, 1650, for example, 1770, where there were warming periods in between. It wasn't as cold as an ice age, but it did put pressure on people. Okay, so we also have to be clear that when we're looking at the environment, we're not environmentally deterministic. What that means is some people think of the environment as determining what people do, right? So if it warms up, people will react this way. If it cools down, people will react another way. You can't necessarily predict how people will react and how they reacted in ancient times. So the environment has an influence, but it doesn't determine how people behave. So there are many important questions that are related to ancient environments, such as the origins of agriculture. And so we can look at the timing of agricultural development. When did people develop agriculture? Why did certain civilizations collapse? Perhaps it's dependent or somehow related to climate change. Why did people move out of an area and into another area? Did their climate change, or did the weather change in their area, putting pressure on them, forcing them to look for other locations for food? That's a possibility. So when you're looking at these kinds of hypotheses, it's important to reconstruct the climate so that you can rule them out or say, yes, they have support. Okay. We also want to look at the impact that human beings have on the environment as well, right? So not only does the environment influence humans, humans influence the environment. And it would be incorrect to believe that that climate change or that negative impacts on the environment are only something that we see today. It's obviously much more accelerated and much more severe today, but ancient people were also degrading their own environment. We'll see this with one particular site in Jordan, an ancient farming village called Ain Ghazal. So we want to look at both, how people impacted the environment, impacted their local environment as well. And this obviously relates to current research on climate science, right? We need a comparison or to compare modern climate, modern CO2 levels, modern temperatures. It's important to have that background so that we can say, is what going on currently unusual or not? And it is. You probably are familiar with the Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist, the so-called hockey stick, right? This exponential increase in temperature, which is created by increasing CO2 levels that are anthropogenic, caused by humans, right? You all know this. As we're going to see, the reconstructions of temperature are based not on just one data set, but several data sets that support each other. 99% of climate scientists agree that the climate is changing and is caused by humans, and we can see the impact of this. The record-setting summer temperatures, just in the last decade, record number of storms and the power of tropical storms. Okay, we'll look at a couple of case studies within this lecture as well that kind of really show us how the climate is an important factor to understand. So, for example, the Norse settlement in Greenland, right? The Norse came from Scandinavia. They settled in Iceland around, I think it was the 1200s AD. And then they settled on Greenland around that time. Actually, Iceland before that, I think it was around 900 AD. And then Greenland. And their settlements on Greenland were abandoned in the 1400s. And it looks like from the data that it was strongly correlated with what was happening during the Little Ice Age and a shrinking food supply for the Norse people who were living in this area, who were eating different kinds of foods than the local Inuit population, who did not have the same kind of collapse. Right? The Ice Age is, as well. Right? Agriculture is an invention that only dates to around 10,000 years ago. And the reason why it's fairly recent is because the climate was just not suitable enough during the Ice Age to have agriculture. Right? At the end of the so-called Pleistocene, the last Ice Age, and the beginning of our geologic time period, the Holocene, the climate became warmer and wetter all over the world. And this allowed for more abundant foods like cereal grains to grow in really large numbers, which eventually led to their domestication by humans and agriculture. So understanding when agriculture appears is based a lot on understanding when the climate starts to change. So there's many different methods. So as we look at each of the methods, try to understand, as you're taking notes, okay, what do these methods examine and what can they tell us about ancient climate, right? So what's the source of the data? What are they studying? And how does it work, right? So we're going to look at tree rings. We're going to look at lake sediments, ice cores, ocean sediments, etc. Okay, let's look at ocean cores first. So in order to do this kind of work, you need a research vessel. You go out to different parts of the ocean. You send a core down to the bottom, and it will bring up a long length of sediment from the bottom of the ocean that has accumulated over thousands of years. Right? And you can pull that up, and you have a record of the ocean temperatures from those different time periods that give you a proxy measure for the global temperatures around the world. Right? Okay, well, how does this work? There are different ways to do it. And you can see that ocean cores have been sampled from many, many different parts of the world, all over the world. So there's just a lot of data that we have to work from at this point. So one thing that scientists can look at are these one-celled organisms that produce a shell on the outside called foraminifera, right? These are kind of microfossils. They are sensitive to environmental changes. So if certain species are abundant in certain numbers in the sediment, you can approximate the temperature. If other species are abundant during another time period, it will tell you if that time period was warmer or colder. You can also use C14 dating on many of these levels in order to date the levels. Another thing you can do with the foraminifera, right, is not just look at the species, but also look at the oxygen isotopes in the foraminifera, right? Foraminifera are calcium carbonate, right? So we're talking about the same kind of stuff that people put on their sidewalks to prevent them from freezing, right? To kind of melt the ice. Not talking about the salt, but you'll also see people throw this kind of white stuff that's basically shells, calcium carbonate, that will kind of prevent the ice from forming. So we looked at carbon isotopes before, and we looked at C14, and we talked about how C14 was a radioactive isotope, which means that it breaks down over time. There are other kinds of isotopes called stable isotopes. These are not radioactive, and they don't break down over time. And oxygen 18 is an example of a stable isotope. A typical atom of oxygen is composed of 8 protons and 8 neutrons. Oxygen 18 has 2 extra neutrons to form a molecular weight of 18 rather than 16. Because it's heavier molecularly, right? The water molecules that have oxygen 18 will behave slightly differently than those that have oxygen 16 because they weigh a little bit more. The main difference is that water molecules that have oxygen 18 will require more energy to evaporate, right? So in colder water, you're going to have more oxygen 18 than in warmer water, right? In warmer water, you'll have more evaporation, and that will mean that more oxygen 18 will go into the atmosphere. Now, some of the oxygen molecules will be absorbed by the calcium carbonate in the foraminifera. So, if you have foraminifera that have low levels relatively of oxygen 18, it will say to you that the ocean temperatures were somewhat warmer. Now, this will be the opposite for ice, because the ice is forming from the evaporation and the precipitation, right? And so people drill ice cores into places like Greenland, just like they would drill cores on the bottom of the ocean. And in the glacial ice, right, the higher levels of oxygen 18 in the ice indicate a warmer climate. So oxygen 18, you can see, is like a thermometer, essentially. You can look at the ratios of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 and then calculate the temperature. And you can see that you get large trends over time, but you also get the small oscillations, year by year by year. You can see the levels piling up year by year by year, right? So here's the foraminifera. So you can use oxygen isotopes to look at temperature, one, by looking at foraminifera in the oceans, and also looking at water molecules in the ice in places like Greenland, right? And they're both going to give you a record of the time period and the temperature. So we're talking about several different ways of calculating this. Right? The ice in Greenland is, incredibly large, incredibly thick, and so you can drill down these ice cores that will give you a real important record of the global temperatures at that time period. And you actually have layers like you do in tree rings, which we'll also talk about. So you can actually see the deposition of the rain or the snow in Greenland forming into ice year by year by year, because seasonally in Greenland, there's each season, right, late winter, early spring, there's more dust in the air because of higher winds, and that shows up as kind of a darker band. And then there is lower winds during the rest of the year, and so there's less dust within the snow and the ice, and it forms up as kind of a lighter band. So these are very distinct bands. And so one layer or 1 year is a light and dark band. And so this gives you a real important look into the climate of ancient times.
We want to know the long history of the climate, what happened thousands, even millions of years ago. But our thermometer records are very short, and we can get a global estimate for only 150 years. How do we find out what happened before that?
We have to turn to natural archives, what we call proxies, like these tree rings and corals and ice cores, and they can tell us about how the climate changed in the past.
Ice cores essentially represent a cylinder of ice that will be drilled out of an ice cap, an ice sheet, or a glacier.
And we take something called an ice core drill that has a rotating set of teeth on the end of it, and it drills out a column of ice as much as 4 meters or about 12 feet long. And we bring that 4 meters up to the surface. We do all sorts of sampling on it.
Not only do we get the gases, the gaseous composition of the atmosphere, but we also can pick up dust fragments, various chemical species.
We can get the temperature of the air from which the snow fell. We can look layer by layer. How much dust was in 1970 versus 2,000 years ago? What was the composition of CO2 in the atmosphere in 1970 versus 2,000 years ago? So we can keep on going down the ice sheet as far back as we can go. In Greenland, that would be close to 200,000 years, we think. And in Antarctica, which has been an ice sheet much larger, been there for a long time, about 1.5 million years we can go back in time.
These are temperature data from an ice core showing the history of temperature in the Antarctic. And you see lots of ups and downs, the temperature changes of many degrees over thousands of years.
What the ice cores have done is really allowed us to scale human impacts. We've burned a lot of fossil fuels. How much have we changed CO2? How much have we changed methane? How much have we changed nitrous oxide? And the ice cores tell us by generally about as much as the natural environment was able to do over the last 1 million years.